Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all. Welcome back on this adventure, mysterious adventure we're on together, exploring the nature of consciousness, mystery of consciousness, which is a nonstop adventure, for at least for me. I hope you feel the same way. So, what I wanted to talk about this time is where does God exist? So, the questions I want to go into is where does God actually exist? Where does he or she dwell or abide? Where do we need to focus on in order to realize him or her, experience him or her, know him or her? And within all of that context of all that complexity, what's the right relationship to the absolute principle? What is the right relationship to the absolute principle? It's very complicated, it's very confusing. It's both very simple and very, as I said, complex. So when I was a little boy, a long time ago, I'm getting older, but when I was a little boy, about 5 years old, I lived in New York in Manhattan, and I lived on the second floor of an apartment building. And across the street from me was a 12-story apartment building. And my parents were secular atheists, so I didn't believe in God. But we had a German housekeeper, a woman with a German woman who was a housekeeper with a wooden leg, who was ferociously Catholic. And I used to sit on the windowsill with her on a radiator on the windowsill. We would look out the window together and watch people go by. So she knew I was being brought up as a secular atheist, and she told me that God lived on the top floor of the building across the street. She showed me the apartment that he lived in on the 12th floor. And she told me that he could see everything I was doing, and he knew everything I was doing, and he could see it all. So I better be careful. So when I was a little boy, for a little while there, I believed her. And I believed that God, whoever that was, lived on the 12th floor across the street from my apartment building and could see everything that I did. That was my introduction to the location of this absolute principle. And so I wanted to just speak a little bit, try to be as spontaneous as possible about the complexity of seeking to experience and awaken to an absolute principle, which is inherently non-dual in nature. Think about what that means, an absolute principle. An absolute principle means a non-relative or absolute principle that is inherently non-dual in nature. How to have a relationship with it, and where does it abide? So when I was thinking about this talk today, I realized that I was going to have to make some distinctions that I never made before between an absolute relationship to this absolute principle and a relative relationship to this absolute principle. So once again, I'm going to talk about. I will explain everything I'm saying. So I'm sure it's not totally clear what I'm saying, but I will explain it. I'm going to make a distinction between what I'm calling an absolute relationship to this absolute principle, the God principle, and a relative relationship to this absolute principle of the God principle. Now, when I met my guru in 1986, great H.W.L. Punja, he made it clear to me very quickly that what I was looking for, what I was seeking for, which was the awakening to this God principle or this absolute principle, was not a concept. was a living domain of reality, and it was a higher living domain of reality that was beyond location. That in a sense we could say the deepest understanding of what the absolute principle was is that it exists simultaneously everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So he made it clear to me that there was an absolute principle that we could find, that we could discover, that we could awaken to, that we could experience and feel and know. And that it existed everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So if this absolute principle exists everywhere and nowhere at the same time, if the source of spiritual liberation and enlightenment exists everywhere and nowhere at the same time, how is it possible to have a relationship with that which exists everywhere and nowhere at the same time? That's very difficult to know the answer. So my guru was so powerfully enlightened that just through spending time in his physical proximity, in his spiritually awakened company, these kinds of conversations, these kinds of dialogues about the ultimate nature of reality were pregnant with the presence of the Absolute. They weren't merely intellectual discussions because of the power of his awakening. These inquiries were fueled by the feeling presence of the miraculous nature of the Absolute. And he eventually got it through to me that something that's impossible to understand with the mind, that the only way to have a relationship with that which exists everywhere and nowhere at the same time is by having no relationship with it. To repeat, he made clear to me through his words and his silence that the only way to have a relationship with that which is with the absolute principle, the God principle, which exists everywhere and nowhere at the same time, the only way to know it was to have no relationship with it. Sounds very counterintuitive, sounds very contradictory, it's very paradoxical. Because you need two, for there to be a relationship, there has to be two involved. And the ultimate truth about the nature of reality that Vedanta has taught all of us is that there's only one. The ultimate truth about the ultimate nature of reality is that there's only one and not two. So if we want to know directly the nature of that which is one and not two, my guru made clear to me that I had to give up having a relationship with it, because it was my striving to have a relationship with this absolute principle, which was pushing this absolute principle away from me, which is what was making this absolute principle unknowable, or feeling like it was very far away. Because I was insisting, Andrew, whoever he is, was insisting on having a relationship with this absolute principle. But since the absolute principle is everywhere and nowhere, which means it's already, always everywhere and nowhere, the very notion of a relationship pushes the feeling presence, the knowing presence, the cognitive cognizance of this absolute principle, pushes it away. I hope you can understand what I'm saying. It's very difficult to grasp this with the mind. And so then I was a true seeker. I was a very committed seeker. All I wanted to do was to awaken to enlightened awareness, was to be spiritually free. And having a relationship with my idea of what the absolute principle was my deepest relationship to life at that point in my life. So having to give up having a relationship with this absolute principle, to me, felt like death. Which in fact it was. It was ego death. Because it really means that your ego, that if you, whoever you are, wants to be enlightened, wants to awaken to enlightened awareness directly. If you, whoever you are, want to awaken to enlightened awareness directly, then you have to give up. And you have to give up your ego's frontal self, your ego's desire to have a relationship with God. Because in a relationship, if you can have a relationship with God, in the context of absolute non-duality, you make God other, not self. That's the problem. So in the earnest wanting or aspiring for this absolute knowledge, this conscious cognizance of the absolute, this feeling of knowing the ultimate mystery that transcends life and death, the frontal self's attachment to being the knower, being the experiencer, being the one who knows and being the one who's having the experience, the one who can claim knowledge, we have to die to that part of our own self, which is a very difficult thing to do, and that's why we all need help to do this. That's why in most cases gurus are necessary, spiritual guides are necessary to help us perform this complex metaphysical surgery of letting go of the frontal selves. You need to have a relationship with the absolute nature of reality. Because once again, the desire to have that relationship is what pushes the experience of conscious cognizance of the absolute away from us, makes it unreachable. So the mystery of the awakening to enlightened awareness is facilitated or occurs when, usually through the grace of the guru or some other miraculous means, we find ourselves swimming in the presence of the absolute, swimming in an ocean of transcendence that can't be understood by the mind, but only recognized by the heart. And then in that ecstasy we know there is no other. There is no other. That this God, this absolute principle, does not ever exist as being separate from the totality of reality, and who we are at a relative and absolute level is not separate from the totality of reality. So the door to enlightenment opens up when we give up the need to have a relationship with God. We use mythic language. And this is very difficult to understand with the mind, but it is what it is. So that's the first step. It's the foundation of everything I wanted to say. And something I would lovingly encourage all of you to spend some time with this week, if you can. This is why when we engage in meditative practice and the practice of meditation, the deepest form of meditation practice is meditation in the pursuit of the awakening to enlightened awareness. And as I constantly try and make clear to everybody, the awakening to enlightened awareness will happen spontaneously when we can cease to have a relationship with the content of consciousness. It's through giving up the relationship. The relationship in this context means duality, the space between objects, between thoughts. That somehow, if you want to become awakened to enlightened awareness, and some people actually do, could be even you, maybe. It's through the miraculous transcendence of duality, which I personally believe is always in the end an act of grace. It's not something you can really pull off as a result of muscular effort. But if you want it badly enough, somehow, some way, eventually, that space that creates the appearance of two all through your experience will disappear. The space will close, and duality will be gone, and there's no relationship there anymore. And one thing I wanted to add to this is that When this has happened to somebody, when that space has been closed, when the two is gone, when the relationship is gone, and the gap has been closed, the evidence can be seen that in that individual's capacity for spontaneity, because the measure of enlightened awareness can be seen in the expression of awakened spontaneity, the presence of awakened spontaneity. It could be through spontaneity of joy, ecstasy, expression of love and kindness, expressions of love and kindness, expressions of miraculous insight, and in the presence of mysterious depth. But it's always in the context of the expression of a radical spontaneity, of an unleashed and unlimited spontaneity. Spontaneity means freedom. It's the expression of inner freedom. So enlightenment expresses itself as spontaneous freedom, not just as an inner experience of spontaneous freedom, experience of free fall, which it could be. It's not only that expression; it's the expression of beingness of our humanity, the beingness of your humanity, of my humanity, of our humanity. It expresses itself spontaneously as liberated love, liberated mind, liberated consciousness, liberated knowing, liberated higher knowledge, liberated presence, spontaneity, spontaneously, as spontaneity. The ego is never spontaneous, it's always conditioned. But the true self, the authentic self, is spontaneous because it's unconditioned. It has a particular flavor. And for those of you that have been in this process of seeking for liberation for some time, occasionally you come across the presence of awakened spontaneity, of a person who's actually awakened and become stabilized in this capacity for awakened spontaneity. And that's the sign, that's the sign of the living proof, the telltale sign that this gap has become closed. The gap of duality is closed. And that opens up a door. It opens up a door to the interior of the universe, the deepest interior dimensions of the universe, or so it seems like, so it feels like. It feels like it opens up a door to the deepest dimensions of the inner world of the universe, the innermost subjective dimensions of the universe open up, and they begin to be felt. They're felt as vibrations and knowing and radical insight. So the foundation of liberation is giving up the relationship with the frontal self's relationship with the Absolute. And that relationship is given up through learning how to let go of your mind when you're meditating. You're good at that. Not so easy. It also can happen if you have a relationship with someone who's stabilized in the end of that relationship. If you have a relationship with someone who's given up having a relationship with God, and therefore it's become one with, that also can be a source of access to the divine, to the miraculous nature of the non-dual nature of ultimate reality. So that's how that works. And the truth is, for most of us, find it very difficult to become stabilized in this non-dual position. And usually, for most true seekers, they end up having to settle for occasional glimpses. Because for this to become stabilized in any meaningful way, I believe we have to really be willing to come to our knees in the deepest way possible for that to happen. I've told this story many times, but I know my after I hadn't seen my guru for a few months after my initial awakening, and then I returned to see him after I hadn't seen him for a few months. When I walked in the room, he said to me, "Andrew, I'm so glad you found a friend you'll never be able to see. I'm so glad you found a friend you'll never be able to see. I'm so glad you found a friend you'll never be able to see." A friend you'll never be able to see. So, so this fundamental point I'm trying to make here in my talk is that to know God, to know this absolute principle, any gross or subtle relationship with this absolute principle has to be given up, has to be surrendered. Having a relationship with God has to become no relationship. And we have to be able to bear, this is going to need spiritual maturity, we have to be able to bear the austerity, the radical, the radical austerity of giving up that which is most precious to us, which would be our relationship with God, our relationship with His absolute principle. So, if we want to become one with His absolute principle, we have to be able to bear the austerity of giving up that relationship, which means, as I'm fond of repeating, having nothing, knowing nothing, and being no one. No duality anymore, no duality in my relationship with this absolute principle. So we have to be able to bear the austerity of giving up that which is most precious to us in order to directly know and experience that which is most precious. We have to be willing to give it up unconditionally, radically, and absolutely. It's very paradoxical. So that's clear, I hope. Hope it's clear. So what I've been describing is what I would call, in the context of this talk, an absolute relationship with the God principle. But upon further thought and further consideration, it becomes clear that there's relative reality and absolute reality. And in the context of relative reality, where the body, mind, personality, karma exists and functions, it's a world of relationships. It's a world of karma, cause and effect. But in this context, in the context of relative reality, of course, we need to have a relationship with this absolute principle, even though at a deeper level we've given it up. The relative body, mind, personality is still going to need to, on occasion, engage in a relationship with this absolute principle. If nothing else, at the level of just sheer cognition. Just because you have no relationship, just because at the deepest non-dual level, your relationship with God has been transcended, doesn't mean at a relative level you're not going to be called to express a relationship with the absolute principle in some way or other, even in your own thoughts. So Ken Wilber, who's one of my favorite philosophers and he's also a friend, I've learned a lot from him. He made three distinctions about the nature of different kinds of relationships that we can have with this absolute principle. And he calls this the three faces of God. So the first face of God, which is the relationship with this absolute principle, which is the realization that God is the vibration of the I am, the vibration of the I sense, not the ego sense. But much deeper than the ego sense is the vibration of the I sense. It's the feeling of being, the vibration of being, the vibration of existence. It's what it feels like to be you at the deepest level. What does it feel like? What do you feel like? I'm not talking about how your ego feels from time to time or moment to moment. But I'm thinking about what does it feel like to be you? What's that the feeling of being, the vibration of existence that you always feel in all your moments of conscious awareness. There's the feeling of being, the feeling of existence. It feels like something to exist. It feels something like you. I'm not speaking about your ego, I'm speaking about the I sense that exists prior to the ego sense. Foundational to the ego. It exists prior to it. It's that feeling, the feeling of being. The feeling of being you. Ramana Maharshi called it the I am. The feeling of I amness. The feeling of existence that transcends all duality and all relativity. So that's called the first face of God is the I amness, which is the feeling of being and the feeling of existence. The second face of God is called I. Is the second face of God is when you see God as the great other. Not my will, but thy will be done. That's when you see that's when your concept, that's when your conceptual framework sees the God principle as the great, as the inconceivable, unknowably, unimaginably great other. And to which you are almost almost non-existent in comparison. It's I thou. First face of God, second face of God is when you see God as great others, I thou. And many people who have a very devotional relationship with the God principle or the Guru principle often practice this inner position of I thou, seeing God as the great other. Seeing the personal self, the personal ego as being small, and the great other as being huge and profound. That's the second face of God. And the third face of God is seeing God as it. God is the great it. God is the evolving universe. So the third face of God is the three faces are I, we, and it. So seeing God as it is seeing God as is both the evolving universe and that dimension of reality that transcends the evolving universe. Seeing the totality of reality, seeing the totality of reality as being God. God is the sum totality of all reality, which includes the evolving universe and that which transcends the evolving universe, which is everything that exists and everything that does not exist is God. That's God as it. So these are the three faces of God, and I'll go over them briefly one more time because they're a little difficult to understand. And when I'm trying to explain this, what I would like you to do is to hear my words, but feel into these areas of yourself that I'm pointing to, and see if you can feel what I'm pointing to. So the three faces of God are I, we, and it. The first face of God is the I am, the feeling of being, the absolute I that exists everywhere and nowhere. I am that. The I sense that vibrates prior to the ego awareness. It's the I sense that transcends and includes everything. Everything exists within it. It exists everywhere and nowhere at the same time. What you experience is the feeling of being you. What does it feel like to be you? Not your ego, not the small self. When your awareness of the small self disappears, there's only that. So that's the first face of God is the I am. Second face of God is I, thou. God is the great other, which is what we experience in a more devotional relationship with God, the God principle. God is the great other, which I exist in submission to the great other. And the third face of God is it. God is the great it. I, we, and it. God is the evolving universe, and that which transcends the evolving universe. Now, I've always found the three faces of God very helpful and very interesting, because I feel very easy with all three definitions of God. I feel very comfortable with God as the I am, as the feeling of being. Feels very natural to me. I have a very devotional nature. I always have. So I've always inwardly felt very submitted and surrendered to God as the great other. So the I thou relationship with God as the great other has always felt very comfortable to me and very appropriate. Very appropriate, because when what this God principle is so overwhelming and so inconceivable, that at times it does bring me to my knees. Has brought me to my knees. When I was able to see the truth of who God really was, I came to my knees, which is what happens when you really see it. And then especially for the last 25 years or so, since I had my own discovery and awakening to evolution as a fundamental principle about the nature of reality. And I discovered that I was really part of an evolving universe, and saw this in the context of spiritual awakening as part and parcel in the expression of enlightened awareness itself, bearing witness to the fact that the universe is a developing process, that God is, in fact, evolving as us, as it, as me and you. This has been one of the most mind-boggling revelations I've ever experienced and continue to experience. How could something that's absolute and perfect evolve and develop? And so it does. Amazing. So God is the evolving universe, something that I've felt continue to feel very inspired by, comfortable with, inspired by. God in the first person, God in the second person, God in the third person, God is I, God is we, God is it. They're all three different perspectives on what the God principle is. And as we, in our spiritual journey, as we awaken to enlightened awareness, as we become enlightened beings, as we become enlightened beings, we will be compelled to reflect on the three faces of God in the way that we think about reality, in the way that we discuss reality with each other. And we'll be compelled to use concepts to discuss that which is beyond conception. It's not a sin, it's not a crime. Just part of the truth of embracing both relative reality and absolute reality at the same time. If we're going to discuss the nature of the absolute principle and in its multifaceted expressions and forms, we're going to have to speak about it from a relative perspective, speak about that which is absolute from a relative perspective. Therefore, we will have to speak about the first face of God, the second face of God, and the third face of God, in some way or another. Realizing that we're just using concepts to speak about that which is beyond conception, but what else are we going to do? God gave us a mouth and a vocabulary because He wanted us to speak and express our knowledge, express our divine knowledge of His or her true nature. So therefore, we have to speak about these things. And the minute we endeavor to speak about them, we have to embrace relative truths. But if we're grounded in what I was speaking about in the first half of this talk, if we're grounded in the knowledge that to know God truly, one has to give up any and all notions of any kind of relationship with Him and her. If one's grounded in that absolute knowing, then one can engage in this conceptual repartee without in any way being deluded by it or distracted by it or confused by it. So, now that I've said all that, which is most of what I wanted to say, when we're looking at these three faces of God, once again, God is the I am, God is the great other, and God is the evolutionary process. Ken Wilber made an interesting point when speaking about the three faces of God, and he said that when you awaken to God, to the first face of God, which is God as the I am, as the feeling of being, as the I am, he said your ego can still hide out in that I am space. He said in the third face of God, God is the evolving universe. God as it, great it. The ego can also hide out in the evolving universe somewhere behind a couple of galaxies or something. But he said, interestingly enough, and I found this very enlightening and enlivening and compelling, that it is only in the I-thou relationship with God as the great other that the ego cannot hide. And until I heard him describe this, I didn't know, I never had thought about this myself. You made this fundamental point that only with the second face of God, which is embracing God as the great other, can the ego not hide. To do with that information what you will. But it's very helpful to think about this. Because, for example, when we're experiencing God, when we're experiencing the first face of God, God is the I am, God is the feeling of being. God is the vibration of Om. God is the vibration of the totality of reality. God is the ground of being. The intensity of non-dual oneness that we may experience may be indescribable and absolutely overwhelming. But that doesn't inherently mean the ego's been subdued, apparently, which is very interesting. The intensity of the experience of the unity of the non-dual state as a state experience does not necessarily mean that your ego or the ego has been subdued or conquered or slain or finished with. And in the same way, when you awaken to the blazing, mind-boggling recognition that the evolutionary process is none other than the God principle in the process of becoming more of who and what he or she is capable of being, which is, as I said before, truly mind-boggling knowledge, recognition. It's truly mind-boggling. That the ego can hide out in that, hide itself somewhere in that blazing inside also. And apparently it's only in the duality of the I-thou relationship with the absolute principle that the ego cannot hide anymore, apparently. So if somehow in your own life you're avoiding and it's whatever this means to you, it's how you should relate to what I'm saying, make sense out of it. But if you find that in some way you are avoiding an I-thou relationship with the absolute principle for conscious or unconscious reasons, it's something maybe you should look into for your own sake. But my own personal solution to this, to all this complexity, is to first abandon my relationship with the absolute principle in order to awaken to it truly, literally, absolutely, and completely, and to become irrevocably grounded in that inconceivable space and inconceivable place beyond thought, and make sure that I'm grounded there, no matter what seems to be happening, no matter what seems to be real, knowing that nothing is real except that. So first striving to ground myself in that absolute non-relationship, not to space, place, dimension of reality and higher state. And as I get more comfortable in the fact that that my best friend is someone I'll never be able to see, as I get more comfortable in the realization that I'll never be able to see my best friend, as I become more comfortable knowing I'll never be able to see my best friend, that makes it possible to let go absolutely. As I become more comfortable in knowing that, then I can begin to consciously and conscientiously begin to engage with some of these more relative distinctions about the nature of the absolute without getting lost in them. And then we can begin to engage in some of these more relative absolute distinctions without getting lost in them. And we can become very proficient in the challenging business of discriminating between relative reality and absolute reality, using gross and subtle concepts and not getting lost. Always knowing where we are, not getting lost. So, as I said, for me personally, I have always found these three distinctions, these three faces of God. First face of God, the second face of God, the third face of God. God as I, God as we, God as it. God as I am, God as I, thou. God as the evolutionary process. I find them all equally satisfying, equally significant, equally meaningful. There are a lot of people who are interested in enlightenment and non-duality that have a very strong preference for God as the I am, and have trouble recognizing that God also is the great other. And God is also the evolutionary process itself. Some people, they can't get that. They only can understand and want to want to understand God as the I am. And of course, this is all a matter of whatever you want. But as I said, I find all three equally compelling, equally fascinating and liberating and meaningful. And there are also some people who have embraced a more devotional relationship to this absolute principle, the I-thou position, and would resist embracing this absolute principle as the I am, absolutely, or as the evolutionary process, absolutely. And there are other people who might be more philosophically oriented who appreciate that God is the evolutionary process, who may have trouble with the other two, with the God is the first face of God and the second face of God. So in my approach, I encourage everybody to explore all three. Why not become as fully enlightened? Why not become as fully enlightened as possible? And remember, one of the greatest gifts of being a human being in this second millennium and one of the greatest gifts of being a child of this postmodern time in history is that because of this unique historical context, many of us who've been reasonably or relatively educated have cultivated the capacity to see reality through different perspectives. People who are less cognitively sophisticated tend to be able to only perceive reality through one perspective at a time, or one perspective period. But those of us who are more sophisticated as a result of greater education and learning and cultural evolution have been given the gift of the capacity to embrace, to see reality through different perspectives. And if you can see reality through different perspectives, reality becomes more and more lit up by the light of awareness, more illuminated. The more you see, the more you know. The more you see, the more you know, the more you can respond with awareness, greater knowledge and understanding, and of course, inspiration and insight. So the more perspectives, the better. And we should, I believe, as part of our spiritual awakening, as part of the process of our own ongoing awakening, we want to use our spiritual awakening to cultivate this capacity of multiple perspective taking and include that as a big part of what it means to be awake and enlightened. The more you see, the more you know, the more enlightened you truly are. But this kind of the practice of the practice of this process that I'm describing requires a measure of diligence and humility and ongoing commitment to the evolution of consciousness itself for its own sake, not just for your sake or my sake, or not just for my enlightenment and your enlightenment. But it means that this process of waking up is an infinite process. No matter how much you've woken up, no matter how much you know, no matter how much you've seen, there'll always be more to know and understand. So to take that very seriously means we have to embrace a level of humility that's very profound and very self-implicating. Always realize that there's more to know, there's more to understand, there's more to become. That's called good news, and that's why I call this evolutionary enlightenment, because it's an infinite process of becoming more enlightened, hopefully, if we have the courage and the level of commitment necessary to stay in it, to stay in it eternally, for eternity, I would say. So that's one last thing I wanted to add. I won't take any questions this time. But I wanted to tell you that the reason that I gave the title of the talk, Spirit is Higher, is because, as I've been explaining, it seems that the position of the second face of God as the I, Thou, as challenging as that might be to some of our postmodern sensibilities, seems to be the safest position as far as our ego is concerned. In other words, with the second face of God, we're always putting ourselves in the position of being small, and God as being inconceivably vast. And that keeps the ego in check. So that's why I've felt for a long time that it is that it's good insurance. It's good spiritual insurance policy for all of us to keep our egos in check. It's good insurance policy to make the spiritual effort at times, all the time, to see our relative self-existence as being minute and almost completely irrelevant in the face of the profundity of the absolute nature of the God principle. So that's what the title of the talk, Spirit is Higher, meant. That's what it means. And it's, if we can learn to cultivate an attitude of humility, no matter how profound is the non-dual nature of our relationship with this absolute principle, which means even if we've given up having a relationship with the absolute principle and have merged with it, which can happen, it means even then we would choose to have a conceptual relationship with God as a great other, as a preference, as a way to keep our egos in check. Always a good idea. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate your presence. Thank you so much.